you're going after sea bass, or any tactics or anything that you kind of look to, like a formula? Like I have my little formula that I try to share with people, but that you feel is pretty proven, so to speak.
Well, like I guess the first question you have is on gear wise, what I normally go. So there's pretty much only two situations that I'm hunting sea bass, which is probably the same with everybody else. Is it's either off going on a shore dive or on a boat dive. And if I'm going on the shore dive and it's a kind of a gnarlier swell where I know I'm going to get beat on the rocks, I typically will carry a lighter custom wood gun, like a 55-inch 3-band gun. And then if I'm diving off a boat, my very favorite sea bass gun, and this is a gun that I've been using for years, it's a 59-inch. There's a guy named Gil Gacula who passed away a few years ago, and he built me this gun called the SoCal Tracker. And that gun, it's an enclosed track, 59-inch. I have either a stainless addiction or Mori shaft, and always a slip tip on it. I only hunt sea bass with slip tips on them. And that one's a 5/16-inch shaft, and I only hunt with, most of the time when I'm hunting for sea bass, it's almost always a float line. And my favorite float line that I'll normally use will be about, 125 to 130 foot. Darkwater's built my last one, and it has an integrated bungee on front. And on the back, it's really cool because the Dyneema inside will kind of change colors towards the end, so you can tell when you're running out of line. But I like float lines better than reels just because in my early days when I was hunting, I got spooled a couple times on big sea bass on a reel, and that just kind of freaked me out. And the float line, I'm usually able to put a little more pressure on them, and just, everybody does it different, but for me, that's what I prefer.
So with your float line, do you put a carrot float on it? Do you put a carrot float on your float line?
Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes. Most of the time, I don't. Phil Herendon just sent me one of his the fiberglass ones he makes, the really small egg ones. That's really nice, and that one cuts through the kelp a lot better. So I've been experimenting with that one on shore dives, and I haven't shot any big sea bass this season, so I won't know how well that works until the very end. But the idea of being able to know when you're running towards the end of your line when you see that float is definitely going to be helpful. Otherwise, when I'm towing my other float lines, no, I just look for that color change at the end usually.
Okay, nice. Yeah, I like that Dark Waters. Yeah, shout out to them. Their products seem, kind of next level as far as like you're talking about those little attention to detail with the line changing colors and the integrated bungee and all of that. So, yeah, Matt's doing a real good job with that stuff.
Yeah, I was really happy with mine. One of the ones that he built me, he was asking me on colors, and I was like, well, I kind of like blue because I was looking for something that shows up well inside the kelp line, and he built me one kind of like a blue-green. And at first I was thinking, oh, it's not bright enough, but when I was actually taking it out in the water, it is perfect. It looks different. So if somebody's driving by it, it doesn't look like anything that would look like kelp at all. It looks like something different, and that's good because I want people to not run me over if they're going through the kelp beds, which is why I wanted a bright.
Oh, absolutely.
Go ahead, Brett.
No, please go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, and then you're asking about techniques. I don't really have any like super secret techniques except for what I always tell people when they're asking me, like especially if they're just starting out. I always tell them go slow. I think a lot of guys that are sea bass hunting are kicking through the kelp just too fast. For me, it's if I'm on a good dive and it's like a minute and a half underwater, when I'm on top, the other thing that I always tell people is get a watch. Because you will be surprised how short you're cutting your dives on your breathe-up intervals. So if I'm down a minute and a half, I like to be out of the water for a good 2.5 to 3 minutes to breathe up. And that way I'm well rested. So my next dive is also going to be a pretty decent long one. Before when I was diving, I remember Dan told me this. He said, my buddy Dan Wynn, he told me, hey, your intervals are just too short. And he was correct. I was probably, in my mind, I thought I was resting like a minute and a half, and it was more like 45 seconds. So by getting a good dive watch, that helped me tremendously. So like I said, I like to have a long interval when I'm breathing up. I think that allows the area that I'm diving, the kelp beds, to quiet down a little bit. Less likely to spook the fish, because you know how white sea bass are, man. If you make any kind of noise, they're gone. bubble comes out of your snorkel, you burp one out of your suit, your fins click. If they're nearby, they're usually gone. So I try to be as quiet as possible and move as slow as possible. And when I'm running through a kelp bed, I will usually start on pretty much everybody does this. Start on the upcurrent edge. I usually will swim kind of the edge of the bed and then cut back in the middle and just zigzag until I've covered most of the bed and then head out. A lot of times guys ask me about the croaking sounds. I've shot fish that were in beds that were croaking, and I've shot fish that were just no sounds at all. In fact, sometimes the best sea bass beds are the ones that are completely dead, and I'll be diving in there and thinking, man, this place is just, it's like a desert. There's nothing in here, no calicos, no bait fish or anything. And sure enough, the biggest sea bass are sometimes there too. So that's why I say I don't have any great techniques to share with anybody. It's just you got to put your time in the water, I think, and have a good circle of friends who are also spending that time in the water, so you kind of know when the fish are around. That helps out tremendously too.
Yeah, that's my biggest thing is time in the water, and then also with white sea bass, they're either there or they're not. So yeah, timing is everything.
Yeah, that is definitely true. I mean, a lot of times guys say, "Oh yeah, they're only there on the high tide," or but there's been many times when I've shot fish on a low tide, on a minus tide, between the tides. It's just, I don't think anybody really knows when they're in there for whatever reason. They're in there on their own time whenever they want to go. It could be on any tide, any time of day. I mean, I've missed it many times. Like, one of the other things is that I tell people is sea bass do variety of croaks. I don't think it's just one croak. There's one croak that you hear most people talk about, where it's like a high, it'll go whoop, and then it drops down and it goes boop, boop, and then there'll be a pause, and then it'll start again. That's one of the croaks I think the males use to attract the females, but I hear other different kinds of croaks too. There's one that we call the motorboat croaking that sounds just like an outboard engine purring at kind of a lower speed. And when I hear that one, and if it's loud, it usually means there's a big school nearby. And there's been a couple of times where, just due to time constraints, I had to bail out of the bed and get home. And my friends were there, and they were like, "Hey, you missed it." Like a half hour later, the whole bed was filled with sea bass. And I was like, man, I patrolled that bed for 2 solid hours. I didn't see not even the sign of a fish. So it's like you said, they come in when they want to, and they're either there or they're not. And unfortunately, most times they're not. They're out in the deep sand channels doing their thing, or some other place too.